Ready?
Recording? Yep, we're recording.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, or wherever and whenever you're watching this. My name is Carrie Gulbrandsen, and I work at Rasmussen College in Rockford, Illinois, with some of my faculty colleagues are on the call this afternoon as well. We really just wanted to create a session for reflection, really, and to help people kind of orient themselves to, okay, I'm teaching online, now what? Right, so we're kind of given a summary of what we wish we knew, just like the name of the session is, what we wish we knew when we first started teaching online. And Jennifer had asked me to kick this off, probably because I'm the elder panelist today, which makes sense because I started teaching online in 1996. Yup. It was very, very different back then. Back then, I was teaching high school English, and it was a co-curricular setup. So it was team teaching with a history teacher, and it was a blended format. So I would say about 35 to 40% of our teaching and learning was delivered online. So flash forward now to 2020, the year that is 2020. I'm still teaching online, and things are very different. But some of those lessons that I've learned over time have not changed at all. And that's really, I'm going to kick it off and share my 2 cents with you on that. And that is to keep it very, very simple. And I'm sure you're going to hear that from our other panelists this afternoon, is to not try to be all things to everyone. One of the biggest problems with teaching online is that there's always a new bell over here and a new whistle over here, and you're never going to keep up. Particularly because for probably many of you or most of you, this assignment is finite. Only be doing it for this amount of time. For now, I mean, who knows? Maybe someday, right? This will be your big thing. But so keep it simple in the sense that, good teaching is good teaching. If you're a good teacher in the physical classroom, you're going to be a good teacher in the online classroom. If you're a lousy teacher in the physical classroom, you know what? You're going to be a lousy teacher in the online classroom. But if you're here joining us live today, or you're watching this recording, I'd be willing to bet good money you're a good teacher, because good just always wants to get better. So because you're a good teacher, isolate 2 or 3 characteristics, whatever you want to call them, gifts of yours, whatever you want to call it, 2 or 3 things that make you the good teacher. Try to figure out what those 2 or 3 things are, and focus on those for this semester or this quarter. Just focus on making yourself replicate those 2 or 3 good things about you and your teaching in the online modality. So for example, I know that I am fantastic at classroom management. Let me tell you. So back in those days, when we were team teaching, I had over 100 14 and 15-year-olds I taught in a renovated auditorium. So it was just me and 14, 15-year-olds, hundreds of them, about 120 of them. You could hear a pin drop most times. Yep. So I've learned how to manage classes online, because that's a lot of it I can't do, but I can do management, right? And then the other thing is I have a really deep passion for teaching grammar. I love it. I love it, love it, love it. And because I love it so much, I can communicate that to my students. And that seems to propel them to want to learn it just because I like it so much. So if I were myself 20-something years ago, I would focus on classroom management and my passion for teaching grammar, and work at getting really good at those 2 things in the online world. Let everything else fall away. Don't worry about what your colleague is doing and what they're posting on Facebook or Instagram or any of that stuff. Focus on you. What's that cliche now? You do you. And take what you hear today and center it around those 2 or 3 things that you know you do well. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer. Am I passing it over to you, Jennifer? I'm sorry, I don't know who's next.
That's okay. I think you are passing it on. There's the next slide. Let's see here. I think you were going to intro, actually, our speakers today, Carrie.
All right. Well, I would be more than happy to, because these are 3 of my favorite people in the universe. We have worked together for, I think, the The shortest relationship I have is with Professor Wise, Allisha Wise, and it's what, 7 years? 7 years? So something like that. 8 years. All right. So Steve and Adam, it's been 11 years. With Allisha's the baby, 8 years. But so we've worked together for a very, very long time. And all three of these colleagues that I work at Rasmussen College, Steve teaches English and communication, Adam teaches business, and Allisha is the best math teacher you'll ever meet. And so they are phenomenal at what they do. And the reason that one of the reasons that we've put them all together here is because we all worked together at the Rockford, Illinois campus. And it was about 6 years ago where Rasmussen made a big switch from teaching on campus to teaching online. And without going into details, there was a day I had to have a meeting and I had to tell all of our on-campus faculty, Steve, Adam, and Allisha were part of that group. They loved teaching on campus. It was their thing. They really loved it. And I had to tell them, sorry guys, from now on you're going online. You're not coming back to campus. You can imagine their reactions. I'm sure you're feeling those same emotions lately yourselves. They're all thriving right now, and I don't think that I could drag them back to campus if I tried. So they're so good at what they do, and they were thrown into it like you, like you were all being thrown into that. And now it's 6 years later, and they're phenomenal. So they're going to share their thoughts with you.
All right. Well, we thought today that we could kind of focus around some common things that translate to all faculty, all teachers, things like lesson plans, assessments, classroom management, things that you might find very, very different, whether you're completely online or you're doing like a hybrid model. And so we wanted to share some of our experiences. I was one of the first at Rasmussen to go fully online, and the technology was nowhere near where it is now. We didn't have nice, flashy things like collaboration tools that we have now. It was a lot more of sort of the Stone Age of that. And I was taking classes that I had already taught for about 6 years at that point, and I was being asked to teach them in a completely different atmosphere. And I know one of the first things that I felt was that I was starting from scratch. I was starting completely over, and that I had to take everything that I had made at this point and toss it into the garbage. And the reality, what I found out as I started to work through it, was that that wasn't actually true, that there was a lot of what I had, things like the objectives that I was trying to accomplish, things like existing PowerPoints or tools or resources that were still good, and that the purpose of them was still very, very much intact. And I tried to isolate those things. And one of the things that I did is I took everything that I was teaching and I kind of broke it down into 3 sections. I looked at things that I could keep, things that were still good and really didn't need many changes at all. Things that I felt were really good, but that needed to be modified for the online environment. And then also the third category was things that were completely scrapped, things like face-to-face tactile group activities, things along that nature. And so what I did is I looked at each of those 3 things. I said, okay, so what can I do about this? So I have my existing stuff that's good, maybe need to change a very small amount. I have the things that I still really like and I think I can pull off online. I just need to modify them. And so what I did is I changed those things slightly with the end intent in mind. And the same goes for the things that I had to completely scrap. Because when you think back to why you created those things and why you did those things, it was attached to some objective, some learning outcome that you felt was really, really important. So even the things that I had to modify and the things that I had to start completely over on, instead of saying, I want to change this, especially the stuff I had to scrap, I want to change this and keep the same general idea. Instead, what I did is I took a step back and I said, what was I trying to accomplish with this? And oftentimes I ended up with a completely new activity or a completely new tool that accomplished that same thing, but was even better in a lot of ways because I already had that 6 years of experience of teaching that, and I knew what kind of worked and what didn't work. And it was honestly a lot off of, in terms of anxiety, I just felt a lot better knowing that, okay, this isn't quite as dire as I thought it was. I have a lot that's still good. I still know what I'm trying to accomplish. Let's look specifically at the stuff that I do need to change, how I need to change it, and what I was actually trying to accomplish in the first place, because I want to keep that intact even if what I'm making looks completely different. And that was one of the things I really, really felt was effective for me in terms of lesson plans when I first started.
Thanks, Adam. So to piggyback off of what Adam said is, you're not starting from scratch. So you have a lot of great material to work from, but it can be intimidating as you move into the online atmosphere because there's so much extra and you're trying to convert those interactive pieces that maybe you had in the classroom. You're trying to understand, how can I make them new and exciting for online? And you've got these friends that are like posting these awesome widgets and everything that they're putting into their classroom. You're like, I want to do that. But to be honest, when you first start, it's all overwhelming, and it's really important to start small and build up. Always come back to those basics. When I started working online, you really have to start with just the core, the lesson plan, the homework. Just really concentrate on the core of the class, making it good content that the students will understand. And then over time, you can gradually add in those things. I've been working online for 5 years, and I just this quarter decided to throw in some Bitmojis into my classroom because I joined a Facebook group and thought it was really cool. But that happens over time. You're not going to have an amazing classroom necessarily the first time you work on it. Just give yourself a break this first quarter and realize maybe, in a couple of weeks, you'll come back to a new program like ThingLink or Kahoot. You'll come back to that and learn how it works. Don't try to do everything at once because you'll become really overwhelmed and you won't produce quality work. So just start small and work your way up. Steve?
Okay, so I want you to think about what it was like the first time you walked into a classroom as the teacher. And ignore the nerves and all of that went along with that for just a minute, but think about what you planned to do and your lesson plans. And what did you have planned if something didn't work? Because that is something you're going to occasionally come across when you are in this kind of new environment. It's something that all of us have had to deal with as well. I'm going to try this out and see how it works, and some things aren't going to work, and that's fair. A lot of this is making sure that you have multiple ways to address all of the things that you want to talk about with your students or all of the lessons that you want to do. So starting with your lesson plan, what are all the different ways that I can try to get this information to my students? What are all the different ways I can teach this? What are all the different things that I can do? What are the things I want to try? What am I going to do if this thing that I've tried doesn't work? A lot of this is experimentation. And the scary thing about that on the surface is thinking that some of this stuff isn't going to work, but that's okay. That's why you have multiple ways of doing this, and being willing to say, I'm going to try it this way. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to try it this way. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to try it this way, is how all of this goes together. I go through my classes every year, and I've been teaching online exactly 1 quarter less than Allisha has. She told me she was going fully online. I told her that will probably never happen to me, and the next quarter it did. I go through my classes every year and tweak them and change them and say, how do I want to do this differently? How do I want to try this differently? And so it's sort of a constant experimentation. What can I do to find a new way to communicate this to my students? Don't be scared of that. Realize that that's part of the adventure of this. And that sort of mindset, I'm going to try this out and see if it works. And if it doesn't, well, I'm going to try something else, is a very positive attitude to have, rather than I'm going to try this and I hope it works and I don't know what I'm going to do if it doesn't. Embrace the fact that some of these things are going to work and some of them aren't. And if they don't, it's okay if they don't. But have that sort of, I'm going to try this and this and this and this, and we'll get something that works out of all of these things. And I think we can move on to the next slide.
So the second thing that we want to take a look at was classroom management, which is probably, my wife is a middle school teacher, and it is something that she is very, very concerned about. She's fully online, and there have been reports from other teachers that she knows about it being very difficult to keep students, middle schoolers, right, to keep them communicating effectively, to kind of keep things managed in a way that isn't pure chaos. And I think that that's a really important thing. And I can remember struggling with that and being very concerned about that when I first started, is how can I actually manage the environment? What does classroom management look like? And what I would tell you is that it is still there. The indicators are different. The way that it works is different. You look at things, you pay attention to different things. So in a classroom, face to face, you might be looking at facial expressions. You might be looking at body language. You can look at specific students and get them to act in a certain way. And you can draw things out of them. The objectives, the things that you're trying to accomplish still exist, but you look in different places. You pay attention to different things. So for example, one of the things that I pay very close attention to is people that are trying to unmute during a discussion, because that unmute, when they go to unmute themselves, and you can see the little indicator where it drops like the microphone, is an indication that they want to participate, that they want to talk. So maybe someone else starts talking, but you see them unmute. So you see a second student unmute, and they're kind of waiting their turn. And you can immediately jump in after the first student's comment and call on that student. You know, it's a form of raising their hand. And I know that a lot of these tools have ways built in to do things like raising your hand, but the point that I'm trying to make is that the indicators are there, but you have to look, you have to feel it out and figure out the different places to look in order to do that. So don't feel like it's completely out the window. I would also tell you to set up standards and expectations when it comes to communication up front. The very first thing that I do in the very first course of every term is I talk about how my class is a discussion and how I want participation. And you know, students will do that in a very different way. Sometimes it's using their microphone, sometimes it's using the chat. Don't think that they're necessarily not paying attention or participating because they don't use their voice and they're more comfortable with the chat. It's more of an extrovert versus introvert way of interacting. But I set that standard. Hey, I want your participation. This is a discussion. And I know that that's not always the case, because people watching this are probably dealing with kindergarten all the way through seniors. And you have to make that judgment call for what's appropriate. But setting that standard, saying these are the expectations. Here's how we're going to do this. Here's how communication is going to work in here. Here's how I'm going to manage the classroom. It's a really, really important way. And I'm sure with younger students, this will take longer. It's something, you know, I mentioned my wife, but I also have a kindergartner who just started. He started yesterday, and they're spending a week at least just on things like how do we work the technology and how do we communicate as a form of managing the classroom. That's really, really smart in my eyes, because you want to set that standard so that it becomes a little bit easier, but also that you still get that environment that you want, where you're having interaction, where students are learning and growing as close to as possible the face-to-face version of the course. Allisha?
Thanks, Adam. So I have the portion about fun. And when you think of fun, you definitely think of math. I know. I don't know why they assigned me this part, but I do love to have fun in my classroom. And I don't have as much of an issue with management because everybody's so stressed out about learning math. So they're worried and they're coming in fully prepared to interact. But with classrooms, it's really important to connect with your students through engagement. I know when I first started, it was hard for me to connect a lot with students. And because it's so isolating, and it can be a little cold if you don't inject your personality, which Steve will get to in a second. But try to integrate some fun. You know, make sure when you're doing your live classrooms that you show your video and show so that they have somebody to connect with. And when they connect and grow a relationship with you, they tend to respect you a little bit more versus just somebody out there in the world. Make sure, you know, you're joking with your class. I use memes and humor a lot in my live classrooms just to keep them connected and laughing and break up, you know, math. But I also use emojis in a lot of my communication with students, just because sometimes emails can come off really harsh. And it's just to lighten the mood a little bit. You can still be professional while interjecting fun and humor. If you would do it in your classroom, feel free to do that online. A lot of those can transfer, right? A lot of those posters you can just post right on top, and it's actually easier to do on your computer. So remember, when you're doing your live classrooms, just keep having fun, connecting with those students, and you'll pull them in gradually. Steve?
Thank you. So one of the things that happens in a standard traditional classroom is that your students get to know you over time just simply by being around you. There's sort of that almost an osmosis of they just find out your likes and what you're like and who you are over time. And with online classes, that was one of the big knocks against it, years ago, and still is something that people tend to worry about, is that the classroom feels very sterile. And you as the teacher oftentimes feel like you're just a name and you're not a real person. So one of the things that's really important to do is to inject your personality into your classroom, to let your students know who you are. And there are a lot of ways to do that. So for instance, when I do live classrooms with my students, I will talk about my family. My family tends to be my go-to for examples or past jobs that I've had. I'll talk about my past experiences. My dogs frequently appear in my video announcements, because one of my dogs in particular, who if I turned on my camera right now, you would see because he's sitting on my lap. They're a part of my life, and so they're a part of my classroom. If I turned on my camera right now, you'd see a bookcase behind me filled with books that are important to me, and there's art on my walls behind me that say a lot about who I am. My students, when they're done with my classes, they don't know everything about me, but I'm more than just a face. I'm more than just a name. I am someone who has a life, who has a family, who has interests, who has hobbies, and who asks them about their interests and hobbies, so that we're not just this student-teacher relationship. We are people who know each other a little bit more. From the student's perspective, it's a lot harder for them to ignore a class when they know the person they're doing the work for. It's a lot harder for them to ignore the work when they know that they're going to disappoint someone who they've come to know a little bit. And so putting yourself in your classroom really isn't any different virtually than it is in a physical classroom. You just have to be more conscious of doing it, because you have control over your environment, but what your students see is going to be, in a lot of ways, a much smaller and more selected part of your environment. But make sure that you're including who you are. Your classroom is more than just the subjects you're teaching. Your classroom should reflect who you are as a person and who you want your students to see as a person. And that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, and kind of to piggyback off of what Steve is saying there, I think it's a really common mistake to think that you can't build relationships online. As somebody who's been doing this longer than anyone in here, I have not seen that. Certainly there's the opportunity for students to fade into the background, but I think that happens in face-to-face courses as well. One of the students that I had, I got her when she was a freshman, and she's about to graduate with her bachelor's degree. She's nowhere near the Rockford campus, and she wants to drive and graduate at the Rockford campus specifically so that I can see her graduate. I mean, I've never had a face-to-face conversation with her. I've talked to her over a technology like this and on the phone multiple times and through text message. We know each other really well. I mean, and if that's not a relationship with a student, I don't really know what is. So don't fall into that trap would be kind of something that I would add to that. It's okay to be concerned about that, because we're not familiar with how that works through technology, but I can assure you that that is not always the case. So the final thing that we were going to look at was assessment, which is another thing that I think hopping from face-to-face to online, or even in an atmosphere where you can't engage with your students. So even if you are in a hybrid atmosphere, or you are doing some face-to-face, but you can no longer get close to each other, I think that changing your assessments and modifying them, something that a lot of teachers are kind of dealing with right now. So one of the things that I wanted to cover is using activities effectively, specifically in the online space. And more than that, how do we use the live sessions that we run to assess learning, to get engagement and involvement? And, I was just talking about traps. Something that I see really often with new online faculty is that they have a tendency to lecture and lecture and lecture and lecture, and that's the entire session. And just like you wouldn't do that in a face-to-face class, you really want to try and avoid that in an online class. And I honestly think it's even more important there because a student on a computer has all these distractions at their fingertips. They can hop online, they can go to all of these different sites, they can turn their camera off and be on their phone. And because of that, it becomes even more important to try and engage them through things like discussion questions, through things like activities. These don't go out the window just because suddenly you're not communicating face to face. I really like using both of those. I'm more of a Socratic instructor. I like asking questions and drawing that out and getting engagement. Don't like lecturing. I didn't like it when I was in school, and I don't like teaching that way. And because of that, you can get engagement and involvement from those students. And in my mind, that means more success, more attachment to the material. So something as simple, I teach an introduction level business course every term. It's this first class that associate students take. And we do things like talking about the benefits of a specific product. And we'll list off all the things that we can talk about that we usually do luxury cars that fit with that particular thing. And before you know it, and each student is kind of getting involved because it's one of those questions that is more meant to get students comfortable interacting than that it is difficult per se. But you get them involved with that, and then you can start to see, okay, well, what don't they understand and what do they understand? And how can we talk about this in a different way? Which direction should I take the lesson so that we can build up this thing that they're making mistakes with? And that's a really easy way to kind of jump in and assess the students' learning just within those live classrooms themselves.
Thanks, Adam. So what we wanted to look at next was summative assessments. So since you're moving to online, this is a great opportunity to reassess how you're grading the students. And I know when we get our classes, a lot of it is already built into the system, and you probably already have a lot of summative assessments already planned out and created. And a lot of those will transfer over, which is great. But because of the online environment, it's really important to reassess the assignments and make sure that you're connecting to those learning objectives. Is it really hitting the objective as best as possible? Or is it just busy work? I was on Facebook this morning and I actually saw a picture about this, so I thought it was ironic. But really trying to steer away from busy work, especially in the stressful environment of COVID-19. We really want to move away from that and make sure they're effective and really gauging if they're understanding the information. And then another tip that I wanted to give is when you're online, you have to really clarify what assignments are due, when they're due, and your expectations. And personally, I found the best way to do this is through, your course announcements, making sure you clearly outline everything that's due, putting it in the calendar, talking about it in the live classroom. Also, rubrics. They're very, very important to help gauge that. And even creating videos on the rubrics can help, or just short little videos that say, here's what I'm looking for, guys, and kind of helping out. And in the live classroom, you can talk about it as well to kind of gauge and see what people are thinking. If you're in English class, what are you guys thinking for topics for this English paper? I'm sure Carrie could add on to that. But just make sure you're clear on your assessments and make sure that you're avoiding that busy work by assessing if those summative assessments are worthwhile to the students and really assessing those learning objectives. Steve?
Thank you. So with formative assessments, what I tend to think of a formative assessment as sort of a knowledge check. It's a way to check to see that students are understanding the material. And I tend to think of formative assessments, generally speaking, as ungraded or at least as very low stakes. And with online classes, with virtual classrooms, gauging how well students are comprehending the material can be more difficult because you don't have them in front of you. You're not going to see confused expressions, for instance, in a lot of cases. And so knowing what students are understanding or where they're struggling, there are ways that you can check this that sort of allow the students to do these checks for you. So for instance, when I do a live classroom with my students, we have ways for them to check that they have to register their attendance. And frequently teachers will have the students give, submit particular words, keywords that they have to submit that says this, yes, I watched this because I know the right words to input. I like to ask my students questions. I teach a class in critical thinking. And so a week or two ago, my question for attendance was create a deductive argument. It tends to be one of the concepts that's more difficult in the class. And what I tell them is, I want you to try to do this. If you create something that isn't a good deductive argument, I'll still give you full credit. I want you to attempt to do this, but it'll tell me if I need to go over these concepts more, if we need to spend more time discussing this. And it's a free way for the students to get credit for the lecture and allow me to determine how well they've understood the material. So you can do things like Kahoot, which is an online quiz, like multiple choice quiz. And you can do that for, a point or two or no points, again, just to check. We've talked about the material. Here's a couple of questions and how much of my class is getting this right, how many of them are getting it wrong. If most of the class is getting it right, we're probably safe to move on. If half of the students are getting it wrong, maybe we need to spend more time here. You can, at the end of a particular part of class, you can say to students, I want you to send me what you think is the hardest part of this, or send me an email, what part of this do you think you might struggle with? And it's a way, again, for students to tell you themselves, this is where I think the problems are going to be. This is where I'm struggling. This is where we need more help. And because you're doing it in a way that isn't connected to a test, isn't connected to a paper, isn't connected to an assignment, the students aren't risking being wrong about things. There's no stakes for them other than telling you where they really need the help. It's a way to judge, is what I'm doing working? Are there things that need to be gone over more? And doing it so that students aren't failing a test to tell you that, or getting behind in something to tell you that. More difficult online, but there are plenty of ways to do this. More difficult to do formative assessments, or to see the need for formative assessments, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But the ability to do them is there, and they're more important online because you're not going to see this from your students in a physical sense in most cases. So, but the opportunities are there to just throw out a question to students and oftentimes have them send you an email or a private message, so they're not admitting to these things in front of other students, which is often very embarrassing for them. And in that respect, oftentimes you're going to get really honest responses from them. This is something I wouldn't say if we were in a classroom that I'm struggling with, but since I can send it to you privately, I can tell you this is something I'm having trouble with, or this is what I'm not understanding.
So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. We really just wanted to, there's a reason that each of these bullet points starts with you can. And I think that the point that we're trying to get across is that this is very doable. And I know that everybody's kind of got different circumstances to some degree, and that it is different. I was talking about my wife earlier. She was making the comparison to it being her very first year. Like, that's kind of where she's at in terms of stress level and trying to develop things, but that it is possible. Try not to put too much stress on yourself, and understand that a lot of what you have still works, and a lot of the principles that you've run your classroom with for a long time, they still translate. They can still be effective. They're just a little bit different. So we want to leave some time for questions if anybody has any. We're open to that. And hopefully this was helpful.
Different
well,
isn't bad, right, Adam?
Right. It's just, yeah, ambiguity can cause anxiousness. That's how I describe it.
And while people were formulating questions, it's worth noting that all three of us were in exactly this position 5 or 6 years ago, and there were fewer tools 5 or 6 years ago. 6, 7 years ago, if you had told me I would be teaching entirely online, I would have called you a liar. And yet here I am, and happy to be in an online environment with my classes. So you can do this, and all three of us are evidence of the fact that it can be done.
Things have definitely come a long way in 6 years. It'll be interesting where it goes in the next 6 years, especially since the demand on technology is so high. You're going to see a lot of new investments and a lot of new products coming out for the online environment. So it'll be interesting what they come up with. You never know. Tiffany has a question. She said, best advice for getting students engaged and buying into the idea of school online. What do you guys think?
That's a good question. Oh, man.
Yeah.
It's like
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just to say that's like a change management question, right? So like, how do you get them? Part of it is selling them on the benefits of it, but then another part of it is sort of showing them the value after the change has taken place, which I know is really easy for me to say in 2 sentences, but a lot harder for you to put into practice. I think that there are advantages though, and that you have to call those out, call attention to those types of things. Did you have something to add, Carrie? Look at me managing the classroom.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that it's a mind shift that we all have to make. And I mean, nationally, right? This online is less than, because everything we do for so much of our lives now, when we need to learn something, we go on YouTube. I just bought something the other day, doesn't matter what. And I didn't even look at the manual, which for me, I'm a manual reader. I'm the person that has to read the manual first. Just tossed it behind me and went right to YouTube and went, how do you put this darn thing together? Sure enough, it was one of those screens, those fabric screens you Velcro over your back door instead of buying an actual screen. I just went on to YouTube and there was some lady showing me where to put the Velcro. We do that. We don't even think about it. So why is there this resistance to learning science or art or math online? That's what we have to get over, and we have to help people understand that we're comfortable with it in every other aspect of our lives. What is it about school that makes us so uncomfortable?
I would say I have to sell math every single 5.5 weeks. So my best suggestion is really going back to what I said, making it fun, making it engagement, making them want to be there. Like Adam was talking about, calling them out, make that conversation, like coming up with their business plan or what have you. I haven't taken a business class, Adam, so I apologize. That's a terrible example. But making it engaging can be the selling point on there. And Gina said, do you have something specific you use to take attendance?
I actually had one thing really quickly to say about engagement, just very quickly. A lot of it, getting students engaged online is the same as getting students engaged in a typical classroom. A lot of it is just enthusiasm. I love my subject. I love talking about this stuff, and I try to inject that in everything I do in my classrooms. And getting students interested in it a lot of times is just them seeing how interested I am in it.
Isn't it the same as like getting students excited, even to come to class, like getting them engaged? It's almost the same atmosphere online where you can still call on the student and be like, what do you think?
Absolutely.
So you could still do that idea. It's just about feeling comfortable enough to do that in the online class. Gina, we use WebEx, and WebEx actually takes attendance, and you can look it up afterwards. But we generally, what we do is we have a live classroom question because they can watch the recording, and then they just enter the live classroom code word question after they watch the recording.
Yeah, it's
And
basically like a low tech way to log attendance to prove that they were actually in attendance for the live session, where you just say, okay, here are some keywords, or here's a question that you have to answer, and then you create that within your shell, whatever you're using, where it's worth either very little points or no points at all, but allows you to see that, okay, this student went in and actually answered the question appropriately.
and to go back to one of the things we talked about, it's a great opportunity for a formative assessment. Did you watch this? Here's a question that refers specifically to what we talked about that shows me your comprehension of the material.
Yep. And in terms of the previous question, one thing I would add is to get the students involved. I mean, we've mentioned that, right? But since kids are so tech savvy, most kids, let them take over in many ways. I mean, it's controlled chaos, but it's still to get them using those tools and help you. I learned so much from my students, right? I'll pretend that I know what I'm doing, and then I'll say, okay, but now I'd like you to teach this back, or now I'd like you to use this tool. And sure enough, they'll learn it. And I bet they can do it in second grade too. And they show you what they can do. So that's one thing about the online environment is you can turn those project-based assignments that you might have onto the students. I mean, what could your students come up with the times tables to present online? What kind of project could they do? What kind of, I have some little cousins, kids that have YouTube channels. They're 7 years old. I mean, I think we need to capitalize on that. I don't know, but what can translate from that into your classroom?
Jennifer, were there any other questions that you had written down that you wanted to ask us? Or anybody in general?
Yes, I was just kind of looking through some of the things that that some teachers had talked about, and they talked about how to build community online. That was a big concern. How to build that classroom community virtually.
I think a big thing, I think that kind of goes back a little bit to some of the things that we covered in the classroom management portion, where, make it feel like an actual class as opposed to just a video that they're watching online. So that it can be things like enthusiasm and interaction, and not just here's a key thing too, something that took me years to learn, was that it's not just interaction with you, right? Community is not two people. It's interaction with each other. So getting them to build upon the comments that they make. Oh, Allisha, what do you think about what Carrie just said? Do you agree with that? Or here's a question where I might say something like, one of the things when I teach leadership is we go through a handful of leadership theories, and I say, well, which of these do you think you are? Okay, well, I'm going to pick this theory for me. And okay, well, Steve, what did you think about that? Do you agree with that? Is that the type of leadership that you have, that you kind of conform to? And so when you get that conversation, not just with you, but with each other, I think that really helps build that community. And they get to see the personality of the other students and learn about the other students. Because again, like that relationship building that takes place in school is a big deal. And you just have to kind of manage it differently online.
Some of it is about making it about them, and asking them to do some of the work for you in this sense. I had a live classroom last night for my critical thinking class, and one of the things I did, since the session was about fallacious thinking, logical fallacies, and pseudoscience, is I sent all of my students their horoscope. And I said, before you show up tonight, I want you to take a look at this, because we're going to discuss this. And so they had to come knowing that we were going to be talking about this thing that I sent them, and it was going to be, in some respects about them. The reveal, by the way, was everybody got the same horoscope reading. So lots of fun. But I asked them to be prepared to come and discuss this particular thing. And it was something that was specifically about their lives. And that's going to get them involved in what's going on. And the students who are going to watch that as a recording, I've asked them to do the same thing and said, if you haven't looked at this yet, pause the recording now, go take a look at this and come back.
One thing that I will say is underrated is icebreakers, just to get that conversation started and getting people engaged into the classroom, just stuff that has nothing to do with, math or business or English. Just how was your weekend? Things you would talk about in class, you would talk about online. There doesn't have to be a huge change. And I think that's really the overarching theme of our lecture today, is that even though it seems like this huge change, a lot of those ideas and concepts that are effective can be transferred over and work rather effectively to connect with those students. So Tiffany said, can you all speak to lesson pacing and the balance of direction, instruction, class discussion, and independent work time? You're muted, Adam.
I know. I just
Oh.
groaned because that's a very good question. It is a difficult thing to do in any form of class, right? So how do you know how quickly to go? How do you pace in a way that both pushes the good students but accommodates the students that are struggling with a particular topic? I think for me, a lot of that is availability. A lot of that is making it very clear that I'm open to questions and that you can reach out, and trying to accommodate from there, which is not the best answer, I know, because it's a very difficult thing to kind of achieve. But that if the students are willing, I mean, the first thing is, right, you're using things like formative assessment to see how students are doing, and then you can isolate cases where students are struggling, and you'll get that from summative assessments too. But then the idea is, how quickly do I move on? And I think if you have the resources to make students comfortable and to feel like they can reach out and that the help is there, that they can catch up to whatever pacing that you deem. I mean, that's sort of my perspective. I don't know. Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
Formative assessments are really critical for this. If you're asking the sort of like, can you repeat this back to me? Or, this is what I've traditionally seen as the most difficult concept, or the hardest part of this. Can you explain it back to me in an email type of thing? Or as a, verify your attendance type of thing. They'll give you a good handle on whether or not students are following along, and it'll help you pinpoint the students who might need more attention. And like Adam, a lot of it, a lot of it is availability. All of my students have my cell phone number. All of my students have multiple emails they can reach me at. And so they know that if they are struggling with something or having a problem, that I will be there to help them, or I'll be there at least for a shoulder to cry on.
I agree with both of you. That doesn't help the conversation at all. But yeah, just make sure you're pacing at a normal pace that you would have in the classroom, and giving them breaks. Don't lecture for even 45 minutes is way too much. You need to have that interaction where you're lecturing for short periods. You're letting the students think about that and practice on their own, maybe have discussions amongst themselves, and then come back and reassess, do those formative assessments, even if it's like a Kahoot where you're just assessing how they're doing. With online education, it's really important to have those formative assessments to, as Steve was saying, see where they're at, so And another thing is, it comes with time to know how students are reacting. So when I'm teaching my math lesson, I know if students are not getting it by the time delay in their responses. Like, it's not all technology in that time delay, but I can usually get a feel for how they're getting it or not. And then, as Steve was saying before, having those different resources on what should we do next to either work on that material a little more or take a break in a different manner.
How about polling? I don't know if Google Classroom or whatever platform you're using has a polling feature, but just like if we're supposed to be simulating a physical classroom environment, right? You're doing your questioning techniques, you're scanning the students, you're looking for the light bulbs or the bulb going out. But if you use a polling feature and keep it very, my mantra, keep it very, very simple, just some some real-time formatted data that you can get, you could throw in there. You can make it a multiple choice question. See what percentage of the kids are with you, are on the same page. So I think that would help with your pacing to know when you have to build those polls in. And your 7th week of doing this is going to look markedly different than your first week. And you'll start to figure it out. So give yourself a break these first couple of weeks and know that, the you 6 weeks from now is going to be a completely different online teacher. But look, check into polling features. Kahoot is more of a gamification. But I think there's some simple polling tools that even Google Classroom might have.
Yeah, I would say my class is like overloaded with those formative assessments and with direction. It's not just checking in. Does that make sense? Does anybody have questions on that? Nobody ever has questions. But more direct and sort of encouraging interaction. Getting comfortable with silence sometimes while you're waiting for somebody to chime in or to chat, because that's the other thing too. Like I mentioned earlier, students aren't all going to be comfortable interacting in the same way, whether that's talking through their mic or typing.
And that idea of silence is in a lot of ways more important to online than it is in a physical classroom, because you are going to have students who are going to type responses. And so I have gotten in the habit, and this is cheesy, but I do it, of when I ask a question, I will silently do the Jeopardy theme in my head to give them a chance to answer and not interrupt their thinking process, particularly if they are going to be using a chat feature or something like that to answer.
Hey, Jennifer, since this is a recording, do we want to offer, if anybody has questions after watching the recording, maybe if they send them to you, Jennifer? I don't want to put that on you.
Oh,
but
okay.
then
Great idea.
We'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Okay, that's a great idea. So if anyone has questions, they can email info@goldenappleofrockford.com, and I can get those questions out to our presenters. Thank you, Allisha. That's great. I love that. I have one question to throw out to all of you regarding equipment and technology that might make your job teaching online a little easier. And I ask you this because Golden Apple is offering the opportunity for teachers to apply for up to $300 each for books, equipment, and technology. And so, little things like I noticed a headset that Adam is using, things like that. Is there little things that you think makes it easier for you?
I have a really big suggestion that most people probably don't think about, and that is get a second monitor. Because you can put all of the faces on a screen.
100% agree.
And this is mine over here. You see how there's like too much light on this side of my face? It's because it's my second monitor. And all the faces go there. And what I'm working on goes here. And at any point I can look and see, and they're not this big. And it is much easier for classroom management for me to ask a question or for me to be demoing something, and then for me to look over and to see who's engaged, what are they typing, because all the communication stuff goes on one page or on one screen, and all of whatever I'm working on goes on the other. And it just, from an organization and effectiveness, I can't recommend it enough. And like a good monitor is $100, which that's not crazy compared to some of the other solutions that you see kicked around online for this.
I would throw there an external hard drive if you can, because those are about $50 or $60. So you're going to come up with some brilliant tools that you've written or that you've created, and then your computer or laptop would crash. So I would get an external drive beyond a flash drive, because you may have videos and stuff you want to save on there, so that you'll have it from quarter to quarter. And who knows, when you go back into the physical classroom, you may decide you want to keep it. Sorry, Allisha, I stepped on you there.
No, you're perfectly fine. I have a hard drive too, so that's okay. I will say, if anybody really enjoys working on a whiteboard and they miss that handwritten component, I use a Wacom tablet, and you just write right on it, and it transfers like PowerPoint. You can just have a whiteboard and just write on it. I do that for my math class. This is like $300. So they're not cheap, and I've already gone through one. But again, I've been teaching online for 6 years. This is my number one thing for math people. Because you don't want to have to type up all those equations. You don't want to use your mouse for that. It's terrible. Wacom tablet. Okay, anyways, I'm obsessed. Also, $20 on Amazon, a little microphone, just so
Yeah,
that it's directed.
There are good table mics out there too, especially if you don't want to wear a headset.
I love my headset. I would recommend spending $15 to $20 and getting a subscription to screencast-o-matic.com.
Yes.
It's a $15 for a year subscription, and you can make and edit videos. I use Screencast every week for all of my classes. I record all of my live classrooms with Screencast. I do announcements for my students with Screencast. And for $15, for $1.25 a month, it has been worth every penny I have ever paid the people that make that piece of software.
You can upload it straight to YouTube. So.
Yeah, they make that easy. YouTube or your MP4 file if you want to have it onto that external hard drive. And if you don't want to get an external hard drive, you can use things like Dropbox to host some of your files for larger things. If they're videos, I tend to post mine on a private YouTube channel just so that I have access to that term over term. I don't have to save it onto my computer and deal with all of that. So those solutions are out there.
And I know that we're talking about an external hard drive, but don't dismiss the idea of just a good-sized flash drive. You can put a lot of good essential stuff on a flash drive, and a large flash drive you can get for $10 or $15 that will hold a lot of stuff, including, if you need it to, things like videos. And flash drives have considerable storage these days, and as they become capable of holding more and more, they also become cheaper and cheaper.
I lose my flash drives. That's why I like the big box.
Me too, Carrie. Terrible.
I was the same thought pattern,
Carrie. Full of flash drives, and so we could probably keep.
Not my fault. Y'all are irresponsible. I never lose my flash drives.
Alicia's idea of because we could resources and we could create a.
I'm losing you, Carrie. You're lagging a little bit. Can you hear us?
We lost Carrie.
Well, you did. I'm sorry. I was just going to say if people know how to spell the Wacom tablet, but maybe we can send a list of those resources out for everybody.
We heard that.
Yeah, good.
All
sorry.
Right.
That was really helpful. Wow, lots of good ideas. So for anyone hearing this that wants to apply for a grant, they can go to goldenappleofrockford.com. The deadline is coming up on September 15th, but it is a great opportunity for teachers pre-K through 12th grade who would be interested in applying for up to $300 for books, equipment, and technology.
Jennifer, did you see the last comment? I don't know if you did. Gina just asked, will you be doing another one of these after we get going, maybe in 1 to 2 months? We talked about it. I think Adam, Steve, and I would be happy to do another one if anybody would like to. Maybe just like a Q&A for people, whatever you guys need.
Yeah, I mean, if there's interest.
I was going to say,
no problem.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was going to say in 1 to 2 months, I think we would be willing to, host a discussion. But in 1 or 2 months, it would be a lot more interesting to have you guys talking about what you've done and discovered than hearing from us again.
That would be really interesting too, to have them part of the conversation potentially.
Look at getting them involved, Steve. Good job.
Yeah, I agree with Gina. I think
And
you'll
it's
have
a formative
better
assessment.
questions. So Gina's saying they don't know what they don't know, and that's totally true. That's like one of the most difficult spots to be in because you don't even know necessarily what questions to ask, and that you would after a couple months. So I think if enough people are interested, I have no problem coming on. I'm happy to help.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. You all have been so helpful. Really appreciate your time that you put into this, and thanks for sharing your expertise and your knowledge. We really appreciate it, and I will forward any questions that I get to you all. And I thank you very much because I know you're all busy teaching, and even though you're very versed in online teaching, COVID is a whole new world for everyone. So. And then getting your kids off to school and starting school today and all those good things too. So thank you very much. We're very appreciative of all of you and our partnership with Rasmussen College. So thank you very much. And you all have a good evening.
You too. Thanks for having us, everybody.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.